Hi, I'm Harriet Frew, eating disorder therapist, teacher and podcaster, and you're about to start healing from your eating disorder and transforming your life and your relationship with food and body. I've worked in NHS and private practice supporting clients for 20 years, and I believe that recovery is possible for you. This podcast dives into expert interviews, evidence-based psychological approaches, and anecdotal tips from the therapy room from my years of experience. If you're wanting to heal your relationship with food, feel confident in your body, develop self-love and self-acceptance, and create a life of freedom and meaning, then this podcast is for you. Thank you for being here. So today I have a guest on the show, and I'm talking to Dr. Anita Johnston Ph.D, Depth Psychologist, Certified Eating Disorder Specialist, and author of Eating in the Light of the Moon, How Women Can Transform Their Relationships with Food Through Myth, Metaphor and Storytelling, which has been published in 7 languages. Anita was an early pioneer in eating disorder treatment and has been treating eating difficulties and body image distress for over 35 years. And she has developed eating disorder programs nationally and internationally, and currently serves as founder and executive director of Pono Hawaii Eating Disorders Programs, which has a residential program in Maui. In the episode today, Anita explores her journey into working in eating disorders, and she does a deep dive into cracking the code of disordered eating through the metaphor and storytelling. We know that we can understand complex concepts using metaphor in very memorable ways, because as humans we love stories and relating this to real life. But in society and in eating disorder recovery in general, we're often much more drawn to the left brain, more logical ways of thinking and healing, whereas engaging with our creativity and imagination engages the right brain. For many people, this is where change can actively occur. Anita opens up her treasure chest of metaphors for us today in this episode. You're going to love this. Also shares about the neuroscience and brain changes that happen when we suddenly have that aha, powerful moment in recovery. I know you're going to find this very inspiring. Let's get to the conversation. Time for a short advertisement break. I can remember crying in the doctor's surgery 4 years into living with bulimia. I was desperate for help and wanted support to escape the torturous cycle of restriction, binge eating and purging. My face was swollen, my stomach ached, and I felt lonely and desperate. And I was told that the local ED service had closed and there was no help available. I left dejected and lost, and it wasn't until 2 years later, when out in Australia, still struggling with the illness, that I made the decision to support others in the way that I had not been supported. I decided that I would train as a counsellor and support others in eating disorder recovery, and at age 25 years old, I began this process. Starting in the NHS eating disorder service and in private practice later in my 20s, I was able to put my dream into reality. Seeing clients, families, teaching, and in more recent years, social media, blogging, podcasting, training, and supervising counsellors, I continue to be incredibly passionate about my work. So my latest offering is my Breaking Free from Bulimia online course. It's a 12-step breaking free course packed full of valuable tools and strategies to help you break free. You'll start with understanding and making sense of your past and why you're struggling. You'll then work on motivation to change and root out the ambivalence and fear of letting go. You'll dive into the destructive impact of diet culture and get firmly in your own recovery lane. You'll practice regular eating and stabilising blood sugar levels to create a strong baseline for recovery, and you'll interrupt the binge and purge cycle. And with support, you'll introduce your old forbidden foods and practice self-compassion techniques to become much kinder and supportive of yourself. You'll work on emotional eating and challenging your negative thoughts. And there's modules on finding your voice, becoming assertive, plus developing robust self-esteem and managing relapse with ease and continuing on the recovery road. So 12 modules, self-paced, online, delivered in lecture and video content by me, Harriet Frew, expert by experience, having recovered myself from bulimia and having worked in the NHS and private practice with clients with eating disorders for 20 years. So step into freedom with food now and live the life you want. It's only £111, which is really, really great value. No more restrictions, secret behaviours, shame and loneliness. Break free from bulimia today. Link is in the show notes. Hello, Anita. Welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast.
I'm happy to be here.
So for those people who don't know you, could you introduce yourself to the listeners, please?
Okay, so I am a storyteller, depth psychologist, certified eating disorder specialist. I wrote a book called Eating in the Light of the Moon, which has been translated, I think it's in 7 languages now. I'm also the executive clinical director of Pono, Hawaii, which is a residential treatment program in Maui. And I have an online platform called Light of the Moon Cafe, where I have courses that are interactive as well as self-study for women from around the world struggling with all sorts of disordered eating.
Okay, well, thank you for that. You sound like a busy woman.
I'm busy.
And I know many of my clients have read your book and have listed it as one of their favorite books. So I just want to kind of feed that back to you. When was the book first published? Out of curiosity.
Well, let's see. It took 10 years to write. It was first published in 1996. It's been a while.
Yeah, well, I think it really does remain one of the most loved books in eating disorder recovery. Definitely. Good for you to know that. I mean, I'm sure you know that already, but probably nice to have that feedback.
Nice to hear that.
So, Anita, what is a depth psychologist? Because I've never heard that term before.
Oh, it has to do with Jungian, mostly Jungian psychotherapy. So it's not analysis, like Jungian analysis, but it is based primarily on the works of Carl Jung. That's why stories and the metaphors, because he believed that metaphor was the transforming force within our psyche. So that when you use metaphor, things can change on multiple different levels simultaneously in your psyche.
Okay, well, I didn't actually realize, because I was aware of Jung, but I didn't realize that was the connection with the depth psychologist. So thank you. So what led you, Anita, to work in eating disorders? Because this has been the field that you've worked predominantly for your career.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how it all happened, really, actually. I did not have an eating disorder myself. I should have, because I have the right personality. I'm very emotionally sensitive and highly intuitive, but I didn't know any of that way back then. Actually, I was working as a psychologist. I was supervising a psychology intern who was doing her doctoral dissertation at the University of Hawaii on eating disorders. My area of interest had always been women's issues. So whenever we got together to talk about what was going on, we were joined by another woman who was a social worker who had recovered herself from an eating disorder. And mind you, this is back in 1980. This is a long time ago. We were just trying to figure out what was going on. And the more we talked about it, and we noticed there were so many people struggling, that we said, oh my gosh, there should be a center for this. And after we looked at each other for about the fifth time, we said, well, I guess we're it. So we created a center. And it was one of those things where you create it and people come. And girls and women from all walks of life, all sizes, all ethnicities, all struggling with eating, their bodies, body image in some way. That was the beginning of me just trying to figure it all out. There was no field of eating disorders in those days. Karen Carpenter had just died. So people had heard of anorexia. Bulimia had just gotten into the DSM, and binge eating disorder wasn't even considered a thing at all. That's how it began for me, was just trying to, as best I could, figure out what was going on. There wasn't a whole lot of research. Treatment in those days was confined to hospitalization and weight restoration, and was pretty much a revolving door. People went in, they put on the weight, they left, they got back. I mean, I started to think, okay, what is it? Because my very first psychology class, when I was in graduate school, I walked into this room and there was this little old man speaking in an accent that I could barely understand, but I really tried hard. Well, unbeknownst to me, this was Viktor Frankl. And for those who don't know who he is, he wrote an amazing book called Man's Search for Meaning as a result of his experience in the Nazi prison camps during World War II, where he lost everything, his wife, his parents, everyone. And he wrote this book and came up with this theory that you can lose everything that you've ever held dear to yourself. But there's one thing that can never, ever be taken away from you. And that is the meaning you give to your experience. He was my first teacher. I was very influenced by him. I just began to ask myself, what is the meaning? What does this mean? These behaviors, what do they mean? What's behind it all? I just became fascinated and have continued to be fascinated all these years, even though I have some ideas about it.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds that you were perhaps unknowingly quite radical for the time, that you were seeing women of all shapes and sizes and great diversity. You weren't just seeing really emaciated people with anorexia nervosa.
The whole gamut, you name it. Back then, interestingly enough, it was mostly females, girls and women. Back then, no males were seeking help. Whether they were struggling or not, I don't know, but they weren't seeking help. That's changed these days.
Yeah, no, it's very true, isn't it? Definitely see more men, thankfully, seeking help. Although there's still quite a lot of stigma, I think, isn't there, often in terms of, yeah.
Pretty much, I think. Mm-hmm.
Were you using sort of storytelling and metaphor and approaching your work with clients from that perspective from your very early days as a psychologist?
Actually, not quite. In the beginning, I was just listening because I knew nothing, right? I was listening as carefully as I could to the stories that clients showed up with. Now, I grew up in a multicultural indigenous household on the island of Guam where a lot of things were taught through storytelling. I had this inclination towards stories. And as a psychologist, I was trained to be a story listener. In the beginning, it was that. It was me paying as much attention as I could to what they were telling me about their experience. At the same time, I had two young daughters who were going to school at, we call them Waldorf schools. I believe you call them Steiner schools. They would come home with their stories from school and they would say, oh, today we learned about Prince division and Prince multiplication. And I thought, oh my gosh, I would probably know my times tables by now if I had learned them that way. I started to realize that they were hearing these stories even before they were learning multiplication or division, but the stories were seeding these very complex concepts. That's when I first had the inkling, wait a minute, I'm trying to help people understand and help myself understand what's going on at a deeper level. Maybe stories can help. I started using the stories, and what would happen is I would start to see what I called the lights going off in someone's eyes when something would click. And I could see it happen, and they could feel it happen. And of course, now, fast forward many decades later, we have the neuroscience and the technology to show us exactly what's happening. And I'm a bit of a neuroscience geek, and it excites me to know that what I call the lights going off in someone's eyes was actually a part of their brain right over their right ear called the anterior superior temporal gyrus, shooting out a blast of gamma waves, which is the highest electrical frequency in the brain, that actually creates new neural pathways. That was the light that I saw. And the result of that is I saw people's perceptions change the way Carl Jung described they could change through metaphor instantaneously, simultaneously on these different levels. That's when I decided, okay, I'm in.
Yeah, no, it's so powerful you describing it actually. And I think it's something that's still probably not used enough in therapy, is it? I think we are kind of very left brain orientated, aren't we, often?
Exactly.
And it's very much about doing and practical strategies and
Yeah. And for me, the problem with that is if you have a particular technique or a particular recipe or a particular goal, how do you know that it fits for them precisely? So, with a metaphor and with a story, you're delivering up a story, but they decide the meaning for themselves. So that basically their recovery is their recovery, not my idea of what their recovery should look like.
Anita, could you tell the listeners the log story or the log metaphor? Because I think that's very powerful.
This is my favorite because I still get emails from people all over the world saying this shifted my understanding. And so now I say, okay, that's now my favorite. I remember the day this woman was sitting in my office across from me, and I was trying to explain to her what she could expect in the recovery journey. and how she could look at her eating disorder differently because she was filled with so much self-loathing and shame. And as you know, that just sucks the energy out of the room, right? And here you have someone trying to recover, and they're just like so weighted down by this. So this is how the metaphor came to be. And you always start off with these stories and these metaphors using what I call your superpower, which is the faculty of your imagination. And a lot of my clients would say, well, I don't have a good imagination. And I like to say, well, what do you think worry is? Right? Worry is a bad use of a good imagination. So we begin with imagination. Imagine you're on the banks of a raging river. It's pouring down rain and you slip and you fall in and you're drowning. You're getting pulled down through the rapids. And along comes a big log and you grab on. And the log saves your life. It keeps your head above water when surely you would have drowned, and eventually carries you to a place in the river where the water is calm. And from there you can see the riverbank, but you can't get there because you're holding on to the log. So the irony is the very thing that saved your life is now getting in the way of you getting where you want to go in life. And to make it more complicated, there's almost always someone on the riverbank yelling, let go of the log, let go of the log. And you feel like an absolute idiot because you can't let go. And the way I see it is letting go of that log may not be the very best thing to do initially. Because what happens if you let go of that log, start to swim to shore, get halfway there and realize, oh, shoot, I don't have the strength to make it. Well, that means you don't have the strength to make it back to the log either. And now you're really sunk. I believe we all have a wise part of ourselves that will not let us let go of anything until we're good and ready. So what do you do instead? Well, let go of the log and try floating. And when you start to sink, grab back on. And then you let go of the log and you try treading water. And when you get tired, you grab back on. And then you let go of the log and you swim around it once, grab back on, twice, grab back on, 10 times, 100 times, 200 times, whatever it takes for you to have the strength and confidence to make it to shore. Then you let go of the log. The idea is, first of all, to understand there's meaning to the struggle with food, profound meaning, and it would behoove you to find out what that meaning is for you. And this is one of the reasons why diets, for example, don't work. It's just telling people, just stop doing this or don't eat that or eat only at these times. But you never get to the underlying issues of why were you doing this in the first place? So then it just will pop up someplace else, or it won't be very lasting. To get lasting complete recovery, and I believe total complete recovery is absolutely possible. I know thousands of women who have done it. But to get there, you have to get to the underlying issues. You have to discover what its function, because then when you discover its function, that's going to point you towards the skills you need to put it out of a job. Again, part of depth psychology is you go deep, you go subterranean, you get to the roots. And another metaphor I like to use is think of a weed. If you just cut it off at the top, given the right circumstances, it's coming right back. But if you go down and you clear those roots, it's a done deal.
Yeah, so true. I'm so with you. Because I think, again, a lot of treatments these days are very symptom focused, aren't they? But the eating disorder does have meaning.
That. You need that, but you need both. You also need to get to the underlying issues.
Yeah. Time for a short advertisement break. Are you a counsellor, dietitian, therapist, nutritionist, personal trainer, or other mental health professional? Are you seeing increasing numbers of your clients struggling with eating disorders and disordered eating? And are you keen to learn skills and strategies and build confidence in working with your clients who struggle with these issues? We know that increasing numbers of people are struggling with eating disorders, and we know that 85% of people with eating disorders are not underweight, and this means that many eating disorder symptoms are hidden. The Good Childhood Report in 2021 highlights appearance as a leading cause of unhappiness among young people and indicates that appearance concerns are increasing year upon year. So join my Eating Disorders Training Day on Zoom, face-to-face, or self-paced online. It will give you a really good understanding about the different types of eating disorders, including anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, and OSFED, with an introduction to RFED and neurodiversity and eating disorders. You'll explore typical causes of eating disorders and understand how to create a psychological formulation for your client, and this will be brought to you by relating to client examples. I will take you through them, my specific knowledge, skills, and techniques, which can be used when supporting clients with eating disorders. You will get a full comprehensive training manual and access to the recording of the training afterwards and a full online version of the course. If you want to sign up, please go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk, and you might also be interested in my body image training for professionals too. And what do you find with your clients, the many people you worked with? What often are those underlying issues? And I guess that's a huge question, isn't it? But I guess there's probably certain functions of eating disorders that we do see again and again.
Yeah, it often has to do with the disconnect from our instincts, the instincts of our body, and also from our emotions, because we're not taught the true nature of emotions, and also our intuitions, because that's considered like crazy stuff. And what I discovered is folks with eating disorders are very emotionally sensitive and highly intuitive individuals. So, what that means is that feelings that might be no big deal to somebody else penetrate their very bones. What happens is they think there's something wrong with them, and that's very uncomfortable. And over time, they discovered eating behaviors as a way to distract themselves from these feelings or numb the feelings or somehow escape from the feelings. One of the skills that needs to be developed is emotional literacy, which is really learning how to identify, accept, and express your feelings in a way that honors your experience and the experience of other people. Just even understanding the nature of emotions, because we're told we're supposed to control our emotions. Well, good luck with that. You can't control your emotions any more than you're going to swim up a mountain. It's not their nature to be controlled. Emotions are waves of energy. They're not things, which is why you can't hold them in your hands. And they're designed to flow through us like waves in the ocean. And they will come in and they will peak and they will pass. But we're not taught that. So we're taught we have to stop it or get over it or stop being so sensitive or control them in some ways. People struggling with disordered eating, they're trying to do that as best they can. But of course, it never really works, which is why in order to recover, you have to learn a different way of being with your emotions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. And I think it's very challenging, isn't it, when we've been disconnected from our emotions for a long time, when you start to get in touch with your emotions again, it can feel very messy and scary and out of control and joyful.
Because usually these are emotions that we've been holding at bay for a long time. So if you can think of a river that has been dammed up, you take down that dam and you're going to get overwhelmed, which is why learning to kind of create a runoff and address the smaller feelings. So, for example, anger, that's a really scary one, especially for women. We're taught that we're not supposed to be angry. There's even a word for that that's not even used for men. And what happens is when we start to feel the minor versions of anger, like annoyance, frustration, irritation, we stop that. And eventually we get to anger and rage. And then it's really terrifying. So really learning how to address the lower levels of a feeling like anger and just really learning that you don't have to do anything with them. They will pass of their own accord. Just be still if you can, or maybe draw or write or dance to help them pass through. I think that's an important skill. Interoceptive awareness is another important skill, which is really basically reconnecting with the instincts of your body, because that's another thing we've been trained to not eat when we are hungry or eat when we're not hungry, because we have to be a member of the Clean Plate Club or somebody who loves you fix the food. Sometimes those signals are quite a bit scrambled up. So part of recovery means reconnecting with the wisdom of your own body and finding your hunger and satiety signals that'll tell you when you're hungry and when you're full. All the answers are inside. And the way I see my job is I'm going to help you find those answers, but they're inside of you.
And it's reconnecting, isn't it, with that inner wisdom. And often our clients have just become so disconnected and just have so little self-trust.
Yeah. The beauty of it is, though, I think, that the very food itself or the way in which you struggle is holding information for you. So, for example, if you're someone who restricts your food, that's not the only thing you restrict in your life. You might restrict new experiences. You might restrict intimacy. You might restrict making friends. You might restrict your emotions. You might restrict your words, or you might put yourself on restriction for making a mistake. So this theme of restriction is everywhere. It gets our attention around food because it can be life-threatening, but finding that pattern is really, really helpful. Someone who binges and purges, or they yo-yo diet, what you're going to find in their lives is a process of taking in or taking on too much, getting overwhelmed, then having to get rid of it. So they might take on other people's emotions. Someone's angry, all of a sudden they're angry. Or they might sign up for a gazillion classes, get overwhelmed, and then drop out of school. Or they might take on a whole bunch of projects and then it gets to be too much and they drop them all. Or they meet someone they fall madly in love, and as soon as they see a flaw, they're out of there. Or they might have best friends with someone, and when conflict comes up, they ghost them. There's this process of taking in, taking on more than you can digest, literally and metaphorically, and then saying, I can't do this, I got to dump it. And then someone who binge eats or eats compulsively, you're going to find this theme of scarcity everywhere. It's not just that there's not enough food, there's not enough money, there's not enough time, there's not enough love, there's not enough attention, there's not enough appreciation, or they're not enough. Again, when you start to zoom out and see these bigger patterns, that's where the work lies. And the good news is, if you change these patterns with food, it affects other areas of your life. And if you change the other areas of your life, it affects your relationship with food.
And what about orthorexia? I mean, I know you've just talked about sort of restriction then. Yeah. Would you say orthorexia mirrors anorexia and restriction with the sort of
perfectionism, right? Because with orthorexia, it's got to be perfect. You can't have your hummus if it's in a plastic container. And the thing is, it gets more and more narrow as time goes on. There's more and more rules. What happens is this part of your brain starts to dominate. So look for if you're struggling with orthorexia, look for the rigidity in other areas of your life. Look for where those rules that were originally meant to be boundaries have now become walls. And walls imprison us. They may keep us safe, so we think, but they also imprison us.
Yeah, so true. And do you use sort of metaphor as well around sort of body image? And because obviously body image is often a huge struggle, isn't it, for many people?
Yeah. Well, sure. Think of the word weight. Metaphorically, we get weighted down by what? When we're overburdened, we feel there's just too much weight. Often someone who's struggling with body image in the sense that they feel like they're too heavy. What's too heavy in your life? Where in your life are things too heavy? And just look in those directions. And it works the same way with the different foods. So another metaphor I like to use is that imagine that you have two tanks. Tank A, Tank B. We'll call them fancy names, right? And Tank A is the tank that you fill when you need physical nourishment. You fill it with food. Tank B is the tank you fill when you need emotional or spiritual nourishment. And you fill it with things like attention, affection, appreciation, acknowledgement, meditation, prayer, and so on. But we don't know this. We think there's just one tank. Before we know it, either Tank A is full and overflowing, but we're still hungry, or we're afraid to put anything in Tank A because it seems like it's the bottomless pit and we'll never be able to stop. What has to happen is you have to tease the two tanks apart. And the way you do this is what I talked about earlier, is through interoceptive awareness. So that's where you learn to read the sensations in your body. and respond to them. So, for example, when we say, my head is pounding, my heart is racing, my stomach is growling, that's interoceptive awareness. Learning your hunger and satiety signals from inside your body, not from on your plate, is an important skill. But for the purposes of this, let's imagine that we know it. We know what our hunger sensation feels like, and we know what our fullness sensation feels like. We're reaching for the pizza, and we check in and we discover there's not a hunger signal in sight. We're not physically hungry at all, but we still want to eat that pizza. Well, guess what? Now you've tumbled down Alice in Wonderland's rabbit hole and fallen smack dab into tank B. And remember, in tank B, pizza is not pizza. Food isn't food. What is it? It's a concrete physical symbol or metaphor of another kind of hunger that you're experiencing and probably don't even know about. The question to ask yourself in a situation like that is, okay, what's the feeling I'm trying not to feel? So we're going back to that emotional literacy. And maybe you do a scan of your day, and maybe you're ticked off about the driver who cut you off when you were just getting on the road. Or maybe you're worried about an upcoming parent-teacher meeting. Or maybe you're annoyed at something your boss said, or you're frustrated with your spouse. You do a scan of your day. But I have to tell you, most of the time, what happens is when you say, okay, what's the feeling I'm trying not to feel? Because we don't eat for emotional reasons. We eat because we don't want to feel our emotions. What's the feeling? And is there possibly a feeling that maybe I'm trying not to feel? Typically, what happens is we go, I don't know. I feel fine. Everything's okay. Because it's unconscious. It's below the surface of our awareness. The thing here is that the very food itself that you're struggling with is going to tell you what that other hunger is. It works something like this. Sweet foods. Oh, and by the way, if any of your listeners want this information, you don't have to write it down. You can go to a link called lightofthemooncafe.com/FYF for Finding Your Freedom. And you can download a free PDF with this information, but I'm going to tell it to you right now. Sweet foods, think about the way you use sweet. You say, oh my gosh, that's so sweet, or he's my sweetheart, or where's the sweet spot, or oh, that's sweet. We use that word in other areas of our life, and that's why it's so embedded with powerful meaning. Sweet foods usually have to do with either feeling like there's not enough sweetness in your life, or you're not sweet enough. Crunchy, salty foods are often connected right, to unexpressed anger and frustration. Think in terms of anything that's salty and crunchy. Warm foods are often associated with emotional warmth, like stews and soups. Spicy foods, and again, this is whether you're wanting to eat and you're not physically hungry, or you're not wanting to eat and you are physically hungry. Otherwise, food is just food. Spicy foods, whether it's a fear of or craving for, has to do with excitement, stimulation, and change. And chocolate, we know this from Valentine's Day, right? Love, romance, sensuality, sexuality. This is the code. And of course, we're all different. We're as different as our own thumbprints. But this is a way to get people started just thinking metaphorically about the foods, because normally we think of those foods and we're just filled with shame. We're pushing that aside and we're just looking at it metaphorically. To give you an example of how this works, I had a client and she struggled with bulimia. And so I said to her, I said, okay, I want you to imagine that there were one food that you love, you wished you could eat with no consequences whatsoever. What would that food be? And she said, oh, it would be vanilla ice cream with strawberries on top. So I said, okay, I want you to describe to me what's so fabulous about it. Imagine I've never had it. And she said, well, it's sweet and it's smooth and it's refreshing. When we took a look at what was going on in her life at that time, her boyfriend was accusing her of not being sweet enough. She just hit a rough patch with her parents and was desperately wanting things to smooth out. And she was in a dead end job and in need of a refreshing change. One food had all those issues just jumbled up in it. And sometimes it's the language of the foods itself. Here's a funny story. I had run a group and I got a phone call later from the mother of one of the group participants. And she said, I just realized I think I have an eating disorder and I'm wanting to know if you can help me. And I said, well, I'll try. Tell me the nature of your eating disorder. And she said, well, I binge on candy. And I'm so ashamed. I have been sober for 27 years. I haven't had a drop of liquor in 27 years, but I can't stop binging on this candy. And I'm so ashamed of it that I hide little pockets of it in different drawers in my office so people don't know how much I'm eating. And I said, oh, well, what kind of candy is it? And she said, a kind of candy that I didn't recognize. I said, well, what kind of candy is that? And she said, oh, it's licorice. Oh, you haven't had a drop of liquor in 27 years. Put the licorice. And what we discovered is it was the same root issue that had been driving her struggle with alcohol was still there. She had unresolved trauma from being bullied as a child. In the language itself are clues.
Yeah, gosh, it's fascinating.
It's fun, actually, right?
Yeah.
Recovery is usually such hard work, but this is where it gets to be fun.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it really does bring an element of sort of I feel quite captivated as well, and interest and fun and playfulness to it, actually, because like recovery can feel like a slog, can't it?
Well, it actually gets you into another side of your brain. So that's exactly what I'm doing here. As you said earlier, we're so left brain. That's the part of our brain that focuses on the details and getting it right and the structure, and we need that. However, our culture has now become so extremely lopsided that we're not using the right side that can see the bigger picture. We can find the veins on the leaves in the trees and the forest, but we stop seeing the whole forest. So when you're using story and metaphor like this, you're really using a different part of your brain and not the part that's counting calories or measuring or scolding yourself.
And for anyone listening who feels very in their left brain, which I'm sure will be true for many of the listeners, what's a baby step to start to embrace more of the right brain thinking with intuition and imagination?
Before you get out of bed in the morning, before you start thinking of your list and all the things that have to be done, just give yourself a few moments to kind of stay in that betwixt and between state, because you have alpha waves running through your brain that really help you connect with that side of your brain. Another way to do it is just stay in a warm shower a little longer, because that puts you in that alert but relaxed state that makes the right side of your brain more accessible. So those are little things you can do.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, well, thank you. I mean, I think it's so interesting to hear about all of this. Anita, is there anything that you will want to add? Because I'm just a bit conscious of time and I'm sure you're very busy, but is there anything that you would really like to add that perhaps we haven't mentioned that you feel is very key to your approach and with the use of metaphor storytelling?
Well, I think what I'd like to emphasize, I said it earlier, that full, complete recovery is possible. I know there are people out there that say it's not, and I've been around a long time. I've been doing this for over 3 decades. I've seen thousands of people totally, completely recover. Some who've had an eating disorder their entire lives, some who've had the most severe eating disorder that you can imagine. I really would like to leave people with that message that it is absolutely possible. But counting calories, measuring, that is taking you in the opposite direction of where you want to go. The answers are inside of you. You might need help getting those answers. You might need help with an eating disorder dietitian to create a food plan just to stabilize things. But you're not going to be in a food plan the rest of your life any more than if you break your leg, you have to be in a cast the rest of your life. You need it to help you stabilize, but keep on going. Keep on digging up those roots and you will get there. And when I say there, I mean a life beyond your wildest dreams.
Yeah, thank you for that. These sort of words of wisdom, inspiration, and encouragement. So thank you. So Anita, where can people find you and where can they find the book if they want to kind of get in touch or see your online courses, etc.?
You can find me on my platform, lightofthemooncafe.com. And the book you can get at Amazon. And if you want to know more about me, I have another website, DrAnitaJohnston.com.
Okay, lovely. Well, I should make sure all of those links go in the show notes. That's great. All right, Anita. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciated this conversation. I know the listeners are going to get so much value. So thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. This was great.
So I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did. Do go and check out all of Anita's details in the show notes. If you're not following me already on Instagram, do seek me out at the Eating Disorder Therapist _ And for further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. If you enjoy this podcast, I'll be so grateful if you would follow, rate and review, as it really helps it reach so many more listeners. If you're a professional listening, you might be interested in my body image and eating disorders training courses, links in the show notes. And also you may be interested, if you are a potential client listening, in my online courses, 10 Steps to Intuitive Eating and Breaking Free from Bulimia. Links are all in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.